Hi. Can we create SwiftUI apps that scale from this watch to that screen? Let's find out. But first, a few words about myself. I'm Manuel, like you said, an indie app developer, and I'm working on Zenitizer, which is a meditation timer for unguided meditation. So that means it relies on bells instead of spoken word instructions. And Dailish, a day planner with alarm kit integration designed for people like me who are chronically late. Before going indie, I used to work at Apple, but not in the SwiftUI team. And in fact, I didn't even use any SwiftUI at all. So why am I talking about it here? Well, I have been doing it almost exclusively for the last 4 years. And I'm by no means an expert, but I've learned a few things and made many mistakes. And I hope I can share a few learnings with you today. So let's get started. Oh, yeah, one more thing. I'm a first time speaker. You can probably tell I might be a bit nervous, so please bear with me. So, what can we expect from SwiftUI for cross platform app development? Apple said back when they introduced it in 2019, it's not write once, run everywhere, but it's more about learn once and apply anywhere. And while I think that's generally true, I do think that you can actually share a lot of code between platforms. And, you know, I like to think of my apps as a single code base with platform specific tweaks rather than individual apps for different platforms. So I think Apple is underselling it. Let's go over a few high level concepts that you're probably familiar with, but I want to focus on again in the context of SwiftUI cross platform work. First of all, abstraction. You know, hiding platform specific implementation details in the implementation and exposing a nice API at the call side that's focused just on the intent. And at this point, I'd like to give a quick shout out to Thomas Durand's earlier talk, which was amazing, I think. And then there is modularization and composition. You know, taking apart your view hierarchy and putting the pieces back together in a way that makes sense and works well on different screen sizes and for different input paradigms. Now, as an example, I'm going to talk about my app because it's where I made the experience. And it's a shipping app currently available for 4 platforms with a macOS app in the working. What you see here is the timer screen for Zenitizer with the timer config view, which is shared across all platforms except watchOS. Because on the tiny screen, I just couldn't fit that view. It didn't work well with the digital crown for input. So this is an example for abstraction because, it describes the same intent. I have the same inputs and outputs for the view, and it's placed in the same spot in the view hierarchy, but it looks completely different, and the implementation under the hood is completely different. An example for composition, on the other hand, is the view underneath, the bells config view. This is where users can set up bells for different meditation stages to keep them focused and guide them from one stage to another. And on iOS, it is placed underneath the timer config view, whereas on the iPad, it is placed to the side, at least if you're holding it horizontally. And on visionOS, it's floating in a little side window, a so-called ornament. And that was actually cool because when the Apple Vision Pro was announced and we got access to the simulator, it was super easy for me to do this quickly because the view was already modularized and set up to be put in different places and easily wired up like that. Now on watchOS, it's a bit different again because there's so much less screen real estate to work with. That's why you have to tap the bell button to bring up a modal dialog, which then contains exactly the same view. So I'm still reusing like 99% of the code. And when it comes to abstraction, I don't only want to bring attention to views, but also to system level APIs and things like that. One popular example, or not popular, but for me, a very important example in a meditation app are haptics, because if you meditate in silence, you still want to know when your time's up, or, you want those focus reminders during the session. So I rely on that. But the problem is between watchOS and iOS, it can be wildly different in terms of APIs and capabilities. So I'm using a protocol to abstract that away in a domain specific manner here. Another example is this amazing blog post that I linked. You should totally check it out. I came across this while I was doing research for the talk. And the author, Runa, uses a type alias here to create a unified name for platform specific types and then adds common API via an extension. I think that's a really handy trick. Now, how do we get responsive view hierarchies? Number one, and this is also going back to what a lot of people already said, for example, Ben, whose talk was also amazing, I think. Use native components as much as you can, and the same goes for container views. Things like tab view and navigation split view give you quite a lot out of the box. It responds to different size changes, and yeah, it takes away work that you would otherwise have to do yourself. And then, if you do need to have custom implementations that deviate quite a lot between platforms, it actually makes sense sometimes to completely separate the files for different deployment targets. And more often than not, you will probably find that it's somewhere in between where you have views that are generally shared but have certain tweaks based on things like, what you're compiling for, but also environment values like horizontal and vertical size class, so you can respond to orientation changes or window changes. And using things like view that fits, which is super handy because it'll automatically select the appropriate child view based on the available space. Now, this is a lightning talk and I don't have enough time to go into so much detail, but I don't want to leave you without a few tips, tricks, and learnings that I find very practical. One thing I only realized after a while is that by designing Sanitizer Watch first, I kind of forced myself to modularize it heavily. And then bringing that to the iPhone or doing it in tandem was actually a lot easier than going back from a bigger screen to a smaller screen where you have to think about, oh, now I have to completely re architect this to make it work. Um, that doesn't, always work, but if you have a like somewhat fully featured watch app, I recommend you try it out. Now, you want to extract subviews early and often. I have never regretted doing that, but I've regretted so many times not doing it and ending up with a giant view body that was a pain to refactor later. And when I say extract subviews, I don't necessarily mean always a separate view in a separate file that's completely decoupled from the parent view. It's fine to just use a view builder computed property or a helper function. Like that alone will already, increase readability and maintainability quite a lot in many cases. Now, there are also very cool convenience helpers out there. And one particular shout out I want to do is to Handy SwiftUI by Chihat, who will be speaking right after me. And this one has convenient helpers like this, where you can specify different values for different platforms, and it'll automatically pick the right one. This saves you lots of switch statements. And one of my favorites, which is also something that Michaela already hinted at, is using view modifiers to hide complexity under the hood. Something like platform specific checks or backwards compatibility wrappers. It's just so much nicer to read at the call site if you can hide all that complexity. Now, last but not least, I want to remind you and challenge you to pick your battles, especially if you're in a small team or a solo indie developer. You only have so many resources, and a view may look great on one platform and look okay on another. And then you need to ask yourself, how much work is it to make it look and feel great on all platforms? Sometimes it's easy, just a few tweaks, and then by all means, you should go for it. But sometimes it can be a lot of work or simply not be possible easily because, SwiftUI doesn't always expose the right knobs you need to turn to get it to where you want it to be. And then you end up reinventing the wheel, which is a lot of work. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying you need to ask critically, is it worth it? Is this a very popular platform? Is it a very prominent view in my app? If yes, then it might be worth it. But if not, then maybe we need to accept that pretty good, can actually be good enough sometimes, as much as I think many of us have perfectionist ambitions in our work. And similarly, custom views are always more work. Again, going back to what Ben said, sticking with native views makes your life easier on so many levels. And in the context of cross-platform apps, you need to multiply that by the number of supported platforms because, again, with a native view, you get the cross-platform behavior, you know, kind of out of the box. A toggle will look different on one platform versus on another, and it'll feel at home if you use a built-in toggle. If you do your own thing, it's your responsibility to do that. So again, I'm not saying you shouldn't, but you need to critically reflect, where is it worth it? Is it the centerpiece of your app? Then it might be worth it. I'm doing that for the timeline view in Dalish, for example. But I also know it's going to come back to haunt me when I bring Dalish to the Mac. And I signed up for that extra work in advance. Now, quickly recapping, you can share a lot of your SwiftUI code across platforms. Abstraction, modularization, and composition are your friends. And can we now say we can truly write once and run everywhere? Not quite, but I think we can write once and tweak it a little to run everywhere, which isn't quite as catchy, but I think it's a very pragmatic way to think about it. And yeah, I linked my website, which has all the links to socials and the apps on the App Store, which is easier than linking it all down there individually. I'd love to get in touch, so please do talk to me later. And I hope you enjoyed this talk and I could maybe inspire some of you to think about how you can maybe structure your app to make sure that it scales from this watch to that screen. Thank you.
All right, great job.
Thank you.
I have questions. All right.
I'm out.
Oh, no. I need these answered.
Okay.
Okay. First question. Do you have any kind of naming scheme or project structure to keep all of your views organized in this case? I could see it in my project getting out of hand. It's kind of a mess.
Yeah.
Is yours a mess?
There are naming schemes and structures. They are not as consistently applied as I wish they were. So, but what I found to work well is going back to that slide where I said that sometimes you might consider using completely separate implementation files for different deployment targets. That is something where, having one shared or app folder with everything underneath that is shared between different deployment targets and maybe even widget extensions and something like that. And then having platform specific subdirectories there for just those few parts where you want that, you know, star separation. I think that makes sense. Um, and then sometimes when it's just like a small subview that you pull out into a computed property, you can just use something like watchOS dot 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 as a prefix. That's what I do. It works. It's readable. It might not be the most elegant.
Next question. How do you ensure that when changing like the smaller or children components that you don't break anything on the components that use them? Or do you not? I mean, how do you
Again,
wish
I
how do you wish you did
I
that?
was going to say again. I wish I was actually applying the advice that I might give, but usually, especially in the context of indie apps, for something like this, I just look at, you know, I know where the components are used and I just look at them and see if I can break it. But one thing I find very useful is in the SwiftUI previews, you can actually set it up so that it shows you different font sizes, for example, different appearances. So this way you can, even if it's still kind of manual testing, but you can definitely cover a lot of scenarios by just, looking at that quickly.
Nice. Vincent, do we have any questions?
Yeah, the audience is curious to know. Let's imagine that you have an iOS app and you
Mhm.
want to port it to the iPad. Would you recommend first spending time in Figma during purely design
Mhm.
or launching the iOS code base on the iPad, seeing what it looks like on the bigger screen and iterating small increments by small increments?
I think it really depends on how your team is set up. As a one-person indie, I'm definitely tempted to just hit run it. And in fact, that's what I did for the macOS version with, macOS 26. Even a Catalyst app actually looks pretty good out of the box. And I know that I just have to make a few tweaks. Um, yeah, m- maybe instead of going and doing like a full pixel perfect design, at least sitting down and doing like a napkin sketch where you try to like roughly place things out and, see how they could fit before you actually, run it. I think that's probably what I would do, but then I would start with like actually tweaking things. Yeah.
I think I got one more question. I might know the answer, but is there like one platform that really causes more issues here with this, or do you see more issues if you support more OS versions?
I mean, I I have a love-hate relationship with watchOS because I love it as a user and a developer. But it is also just because of the constraints, screen size, and many other things, like even less of a like background processing budget than iOS, and many things like that. It is often the one that feels like it is causing a lot of extra work. But again, I aim to have a full-featured watch app. If you have a lightweight companion app, I think, yeah, that wouldn't, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.